Real quick before I start, if you find yourself enjoying the content, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the like button. It really does help me out. In February of 2021, I was working on a video that I was sure was going to be huge for the channel. That video was on the Ninja Gaiden series and it kinda flopped. But as I was playing the games in preparation for that video, my PC bricked. The motherboard was completely shot, and since the PC was getting kind of old anyway, I figured it was time for an entirely new one rather than just replacing the faulty component. Unfortunately, this was at the height of the GPU shortage, so I had to wait over a month for the stuff to ship at a reasonable price, and until then I was stuck borrowing my dad's 15-year-old PC, which actually was the family computer back when I was in high school. It couldn't run most games, and getting any kind of usable video footage was out of the question because it just couldn't handle OBS. So since I didn't want to just stop making content, a visual novel video was pretty much perfect. Potatoes can run them, and I can make a video with just screenshots. And after several weeks I made what was probably the most impactful video of my YouTube career, except for the one that went viral of course. Muv-Luv is an absolute masterpiece. This is the video that introduced my content to many of you watching right now. This is the video that jump-started my community. This is the video that got seen by Kouki Yoshimune, the creator of Muv-Luv himself. And this is the video that solidified my love for this franchise. And to this day, Muv-Luv Alternative is my favorite visual novel. And you know what? I think it's long overdue for a return to the channel. So please, join me as I take a look at Muv-Luv Photonflowers. Muv-Luv Photonflowers is one of two collections of short spin-off stories surrounding the Muv-Luv trilogy, with the other being Photonmelodies. At the time of writing this part of the script, I haven't actually started reading yet, so I'm not entirely sure what to expect. But since it's a collection of isolated stories, the way I'm going to tackle this is a short review of each individual story that I'll script as I'll go. And I'll try to keep it as spoiler-free as possible, though I'll make a quick note before each section if I'm going to spoil anything from the main trilogy. I'm also going to assume that you know the main gimmick of Muv-Luv and the difference between Extra and Unlimited, because I'm definitely going to reference it throughout this video. You just can't really talk Muv-Luv without it. Alright, without further ado, let's get started. Oh, and for those of you wondering, TDA and Total Eclipse are coming. I'm not making any estimates as far as when, but they are on the to-do list. Okay, for real now, let's get started. Before the Cherry Blossoms Bloom, spoilers for the Sumika route of Muv-Luv Extra. Before the Cherry Blossoms Bloom is an after-story that takes place a few months after the end of the Sumika route in Muv-Luv Extra. And the focus here is on the development of Takeru and Sumika's relationship, though there are a few sub-themes about growing up, trust, and you could argue that it's a coming-of-age story. Or a Bildungsroman if you want to impress your writing nerd friends. I'm kidding. Writing nerds don't have friends. So there are a few things I want to bring up before I really get started. Firstly, Before the Cherry Blossoms Bloom was my first step back into the Muv-Luv visual novels, and it felt damn good. I'm gonna be perfectly honest here. I had a pervasive feeling of happiness while reading that I know was just due to me being excited for more Muv-Luv, and it's going to make it very hard to be objective here. That feeling clouded my entire experience, and I just wanted to be upfront about it. The next thing is some meta-framing that I think needs to be done. I know I warned you earlier, but if you don't know the main gimmick of Muv-Luv, last chance. So this story takes place in the original Extra universe, so none of the events of Unlimited or Alternative apply to this version of Takeru. And we're not talking about the altered Extra universe that's shown at the end of Alternative. This is the OG. So we are talking about a very different Takeru than the one we were left with at the end of Alternative. One that has never and will never go on that journey. We're still seeing the immature but well-meaning kid that was an Extra without all the experience and growth he got in the rest of the series. And that took me a bit of getting used to, but I think it's extremely important to keep in mind when we consider his actions throughout the story. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about it. The main conflict centers around a fight between Takeru and Sumika. They were on a date before getting into an argument that the game literally refers to as Saucegate, and yes, it's as stupid as it sounds. But it balloons out of control and they get into their first serious argument where, quite frankly, both of them take it way too far. But they also both have understandable underlying concerns. I won't say more because spoilers. The plot structure can be pretty cleanly split into 4 acts. The first act is the build-up with funny slice-of-life shenanigans. The second act is the fight itself and the escalation of tensions. The third act revolves around their mutual friends trying to help. And the fourth and shortest act is the resolution. I'm going to be brutally honest here. While I did very much like the story, and it definitely did a great job of appealing to my existing love of these characters, I don't actually think the story itself was very good. It had some interesting ideas, but the main theme it was trying to explore only really got any proper attention starting in Act 3. And a lot of the comic hijinks that happened in the first part of the story didn't really amount to anything aside from fluff. For example, there was a series of genuinely funny scenes where Sumika has to turn down date time with Takeru due to prior plans she'd made with the likes of Chizuru, Miki, Kei, and Mikoto. Takeru, still being the dumbass we saw in Extra, comes up with these paranoid conspiracy theories about what's going on and makes a fool out of himself, including almost murdering Marimo at one point. And while these scenes were fucking hilarious, I thought they were going to build on those underlying insecurities that caused him to act that way. But they just pivoted to another issue altogether, and it felt kinda disjointed as a result. I also think that the story suffered from not having a clear-cut sense of what it wanted to say. Yes, there was the primary message they hit you with as far as what caused the rift between Takeru and Sumika, but there were a variety of other ideas they introduced and failed to really explore as well. I did like what they were going for, though. There was one scene that explored the philosophical implications of trust and friendship, and there was a bit of a look at how a high-functioning sociopath like Yuko would interpret it, compared to a personable optimist like Kashiwagi. But it was very stunted. There was one good scene, and then a hasty attempt to tie it into the conclusion, and it just didn't get the love it deserved. And that was the best of these sub-themes. The rest were given even less care. On top of that, I felt a little bit of dissonance with the conflict itself, and not in a good way. I'm going to be vague here to prevent spoilers, but remember how I said that the fight started with both of them having valid concerns? And remember how I said that the conflict got out of hand because they both took it too far? Essentially, these are two dumb high schoolers who are inexperienced with navigating romantic relationships, and this whole situation could have been resolved early on with more maturity from both sides mixed with a dash of healthy two-way communication. Well, let's just say that the writers clearly disagree with that assessment, and it irritates me. And one last major issue I had with the story is the absence of Meiya. Now look, I understand that it wouldn't really make sense logically for her to be there. After all, at the end of Extra, she had to return to her home to take up her responsibilities as the heiress to the Mitsurugi Empire. But the group really doesn't feel complete without her, and while the story doesn't completely forget about her or anything, I really felt her absence. She was such an important component to the overall group dynamic, and even though I'm not sure how they could have possibly included her, it's a real shame that she wasn't there. After all, she and Sumika are the two true routes in Muv-Luv Extra. For either of them to be gone without serving a greater narrative purpose just isn't right. But while there are definitely areas for improvement, I do think the story did some stuff pretty well. While the structure was a little bit fucked at times and the various themes didn't get a proper exploration, I do actually like what they were going for. My issue there is solely with the execution. I mean, I actually really like the implications for Takeru and Sumika's relationship and what it means to them going forward. I personally would have liked to see it handled differently, but they were definitely onto something, and it was refreshing to see the relationship ultimately mature and grow. And I also did like how they did a short feature on the rest of the friend group, including the teachers Marimo and Yuko, as well as Kashiwagi from the lacrosse arc. They shine a spotlight on how each of these people care about Takeru and Sumika and how they try to have their backs and help when they can. With mixed results, of course. I also did appreciate how they did a kind of soft retcon of the age scene between Takeru and Sumika from the end of Extra. And that was actually one of my problems with Extra and a lot of romance VNs in general. You have these characters who go through these slow, meticulous build-up that eventually becomes a romantic relationship, and at the climax of the story, they confess. And then fuck almost immediately, completely throwing away that great pacing from before. Well, this story basically says, yeah, we weren't emotionally ready for that, and our relationship just hasn't properly progressed to that point yet. And even though they still did canonically have sex, the relationship progresses as if they hadn't, which makes things feel much more natural. Because holy shit, that is a major pet peeve of mine with visual novels, and even a god-tier story like Muv-Luv isn't immune. But I think that they went with a tried and true method of backtracking on that front, and that it's pretty much the best case scenario in my eyes. If you want to see a brilliant example of this, there's a fan-made epilogue to the Hanako route of Katawa Shoujo called Sisterhood. You'll find it if you Google it. Check it out. But aside from that, I also felt that the story did a good job with its raw emotions. Even if the entire picture wasn't quite there for me, the individual moments absolutely were. There were plenty of wholesome and funny moments with the various characters, there were some great moments that broke up tension at just the right time, only to then serve as a complete 180 and amplify the drama. And of course, you can't help but feel the visceral emotions from Sumika, from her giddy infatuation with Takeru to the heartbreak she feels at the peak of their conflict. Solid stuff there. At the end of the day, this story is flawed, but worth reading as long as you don't get hung up on what it could have been. If you're a fan of the original trilogy, you could definitely do worse than Before the Cherry Blossoms Bloom. Let's move on. Best Friends Forever. No spoilers. Best Friends Forever is way shorter than I was expecting. It's basically the visual novel equivalent of a flash fiction story. And this one is pretty straightforward. It's a prequel to Muv-Luv Extra from Sumika's perspective, right around the time she first starts developing romantic feelings for Takadu. The entire story is contained within 2 scenes. The first scene is Sumika dragging Takadu and Mikoto to the store to help her pick out a swimsuit, with general goofy shit happening. The second scene is Sumika and Takadu spending time at the water park together. So, as this is a very short story, like you might want to see a doctor if you can't finish it in one sitting short, there's not a whole lot to talk about. The main crux of what the story is going for is an exploration of Sumika's burgeoning crush on Takadu and how she values the bond they've built over the years while also wanting something more. It's altogether very cute and it works, though you'll really need the context of Muv-Luv Extra to really appreciate it, since so much of their dynamic requires knowledge of their history, and you also just kinda have to be used to the casual verbal and physical abuse since that's just how they interact. But I have to go back to something I said in my original Muv-Luv video when talking about Extra. When you see these two interact, there is never any doubt that these two are lifelong friends. They have such a phenomenal chemistry that somehow works whether or not Takadu ends up with her or friendzones her. And of course, on top of that, there's goofy dumb fuckery throughout the story. The shopping scene is done in a chibi style that's meant to be like a puppet show with paper cutouts, and it's absolutely adorable. Sumika and Takadu bicker and fight in that awkward but endearing way where Takadu acts like a dick and Sumika acts like a child. And in the water park scene, they're still teasing each other, but you get a sense of how Sumika appreciates him and their friendship. It's all very wholesome. Best Friends Forever isn't a groundbreaking piece of literature, but I think it's an excellent supplementary piece to Muv-Luv Extra. I definitely recommend it. The Case of the Missing Tail. No spoilers. Like the previous story, The Case of the Missing Tail is a flash fiction prequel to Muv-Luv Extra, though this time it's from the perspective of Miki. The premise is likewise simple. After suffering a mild injury in PE, Miki loses her cattail accessory, so the gang comes together to help her find it. So Miki is my favorite aside from Sumika, and by a pretty significant margin. She's just this tiny ball of manic positivity, and she never fails to brighten any scene she's in. That being said, The Case of the Missing Tail is about as surface level as it gets, and if you're going into it expecting any kind of exploration of anything, you're going to leave disappointed. I mean, there is a tiny bit about her inferiority complex and anxiety that are explored in her route in Extra, but it's basically just a reference that's subsequently ignored in this story. The Case of the Missing Tail is really just an exhibition of these goofy characters interacting. You get to see Chizuru and Kei go about their rivalry, you get to see Yuko torment Marimo, you get to see Takadu and Sumika tease each other, and of course, Miki acts like this adorable kitty dumbass throughout. Unlike the last story, there are these cute chibi sequences throughout. It's fun stuff, but there's nothing to really sink your teeth into. I'd still recommend it, but only if you really want more of the slice of life silliness from Extra. Never judge a book. No spoilers. Okay, I think by this point you get the gist of what's going on. Flash fiction prequel to Extra, though this time it's from the perspective of Chizuru. But this time, I'm going to say right up front that of the 3 flash fiction pieces I've read so far for this video, this one is easily the best, and I didn't even really like Chizuru in Extra, though she definitely grew on me in Unlimited and Alternative. So Chizuru finds this ugly-ass doll randomly, and then she ends up kind of projecting some of her insecurities onto it and developing a bit of an emotional attachment to it. While Chizuru's issues in the Extraverse are much more fleshed out in Extra itself, this story showcases them much more effectively than the flash fiction we've seen of Sumika and Miki, and in just a few lines of monologue, we get a surprisingly solid understanding of the pride she takes in her work ethic and her desire to be more accepted by her peers. And this doll serves as an effective, if somewhat obvious, symbol of the core theme of the story, and there's a lot of neat moments where Chizuru internally works out some of her underlying insecurities through her interactions with the doll. And of course, there's a fair bit of levity, including more adorable chibi sequences and some good old-fashioned Takadu and Sumika bickering. The one thing that kind of surprised me is that Kei didn't feature at all in this story, and Takadu served as the primary course of conflict. Kei and Chizuru are the quintessential rivals, so it's weird that she doesn't feature despite the story calling for a soft antagonist. My suspicion is they wanted to include Takadu because he's the main character of the franchise, and Kei was basically a casualty as a result. Though it still works because even though we don't see the same level of vitriol between him and Chizuru, they definitely butt heads a lot. My biggest criticism of this story in particular is that there's not really a proper resolution. I'm not going to spoil it or anything, but I felt like there was a fair amount of build-up for no real payoff, and I was left a bit disappointed at the end. So overall, we're still not anywhere near the quality of the original trilogy, but I would say that Never Judge a Book is the first of these short stories that can actually stand on its own, though your experience will of course be amplified if you've read Extra. Good stuff here. Could be better, but I liked this one. The Yakisoba Festival. No spoilers. Alright, another flash fiction prequel, this time from Kei's perspective. The plot is likewise simple. While at a festival on the hunt for some yakisoba, Kei finds an abandoned baby bird who she ends up taking care of. So this is probably the best example so far of a supplementary work to Extra, and I think it makes a ton of sense. See, Kei is a kudera, and that is not a character archetype that lends itself to flash fiction. A kudera is very aloof and hard to read, and the whole point of their character arc is to see what lies underneath the surface and why they behave the way they do. And the Yakisoba festival is set before any of that shit happens with Kei, so this is not a story that can really do all that much on its own. However, if you include the context of her struggles from Extra and why she pushes people away, which I'm not going to spoil here, the Yakisoba festival is an excellent additional look into her psyche, and the fact that the story is from her perspective, meaning we get to see her actual thoughts in real time, does actually showcase how she's much more observant and much more caring than she lets on. And there are plenty of great callbacks to her route in Extra, both with surface level stuff and the big reveals from deep into her route. And of course there's the obligatory adorable chibi sequences alongside the obligatory Takeru and Sumika bickering. Now without the context of Extra, I'd say that this is a completely flat story with no real substance aside from some relatively generic themes and messaging. It would really only serve as a teaser for the character at best. But if you have read Extra, this just adds to the character of Extraverse Kei that we really get to explore in her route, and I very much enjoyed it. In general, I'd recommend reading these stories only after you've read the main trilogy, but that goes double for the Yakisoba festival. If for whatever reason you have not read the main series, first of all, what the fuck is wrong with you? And secondly, this is not a story that you want to read as a standalone. But I liked it. Learning to Love. Minor spoilers for the Meiya and Sumika routes of Muv-Luv Extra. Alright, you know the deal. Flash fiction prequel to Extra. This time, I finally get to alleviate my Meiya deficiency. The other flash fiction pieces all took place before Extra, so before Meiya met the rest of the cast. And before the Cherry Blossoms bloom took place after Meiya went home. So she was just excluded from Photonflowers so far, and I've definitely missed her. Learning to Love is part 1 of a 2-part Meiya-focused story, and for clarity, I have not yet read the second part as of writing this. This part of the story can be split into 2 story beats. At the start, Meiya is wandering the streets of some unnamed city in an unnamed European country. She's reading a romance guidebook written by Tsukuyomi, and she's completely engrossed. Then she wanders into a bank robbery. So that's the setup, and I'm actually going to start off with my conclusion here. There's not all that much beneath the surface on this one, but what we do get is very entertaining. Let's start with the guidebook. The beginning of the story is largely comprised of passages from the guidebook alongside some commentary inside Meiya's mind. And this guidebook is effectively a short satirical essay poking fun at many of the character and scenario tropes utilized both in Muv-Luv Extra and the wider anime sphere in general. It goes over the character archetypes that the gang fits into through the lens of Meiya needing to treat them as potential rivals. And it also talks about the various cliché anime scenes such as the MC walking in on the heroine while she's changing. It's all great stuff, and I love to see writers who can poke fun at themselves. And then the bank robbery scene starts out in a lighthearted way because upon accidentally wandering into the scene, Meiya basically turns into an autistic 4chan green text and just doesn't realize that the masked guys with weapons are robbing the place. And then, once she figures it out, she gets all excited because she gets to witness a dangerous event in person and volunteers to be their hostage. The story does progress a bit, and it goes into why these guys were driven to take such actions in the first place, and of course the scene needs a resolution as well, but I'm not going to spoil that for you. It didn't quite have the emotional impact that I think the writers were going for, but it did all flow pretty naturally, and we got to see a bit more of Meiya's steadfast sense of honor and compassion. All in all, a great little diversion, and I was very happy to see Meiya again, even though there was only a little bit about Meiya as a person. I also like how they bring up how Meiya is still thinking about her childhood meeting with Takeru, because that whole bit was one of my favorite moments in Muv-Luv Extra. Hopefully the next part of the story will give us a bit more on what's going on underneath the hood. Meiya is a fantastic character, and I'm excited to see more from her. Learning to Lead. The second half of Meiya's short story takes place shortly after the previous part while she's on a private jet on her way back to Japan. And while she's alone with her thoughts, she reminisces on the time she spent learning Mugen Kido, which is a style of swordsmanship that she's obtained master status in. From there, it turns into a pretty standard martial arts story. If you're familiar with the young hero and old master style of martial arts stories, think Karate Kid, parts of Kill Bill, the training arc of Demon Slayer, etc., then you pretty much know the basics of Learning to Lead. These martial arts stories always focus on some variation of the hero needing to overcome their inner turmoil in order to reach their true potential, and to understand what it means to be a practitioner of whatever combat style they're studying. Learning to Lead also ties this concept into the idea that Meiya must learn what it truly means to be the head of the Mitsurugi family and to prepare for the responsibilities and difficult decisions that she will take on alongside that role. This type of story is tried and true. There's a reason that this basic structure is reused so often, and that's because as a foundation, it's solid. That being said, I'm not sure that the story was really given enough runtime to really work. In my experience, flash fiction tends to work best when it's done in 1 or 2 scenes that don't require any outside interference to work. I don't really feel like this story did that. Instead of being an isolated story that works on its own, it's kinda like they just took a slice out of a longer martial arts story instead, which I don't think really does the format justice. I mean, as an example, Meiya has the stereotypical grizzled old master teaching her, prickly and strict on the surface, but caring and protective on the inside. We don't really get enough time with him to let that underlying personality show itself, and all we get is Meiya's appreciation for him. Now, as someone who is familiar with this particular trope, as it's a pretty popular one, I was able to look past it, but I do think it's indicative of the greater problem. I just don't think that this incredibly short story format works with this type of story. Now, that's not to say that it's bad or anything. There were some nice wholesome moments, and we get a bit more of the maternal side of Tsukuyomi and a scene with the 3 idiots, and I'll go on record saying that I really like them. They're fun. There are also a couple of cool and badass fight scenes which I'm always a fan of. And there's a nice little emotional tie-in at the end that's a little silly but too cute for me to get angry at. I won't spoil it, but I liked it. So overall, it's fine. Nothing particularly amazing, but I like the character of Meiya enough that this was a worthwhile read for me. So far, these stories have had one consistent thread. They may not be the best thing I've ever read, but they are fun. They're cozy, and they really do a great job of appealing to existing fans of the franchise. Learning to lead is no different. So that wraps up the Muv-Luv extra side of the short stories, and that means that it's time for the Muv-Luv alternative side stories. As this is directly referencing alternative and the story selection screen even includes a full timeline of the alternative universe, or at least the bits relevant to the main series, I'm not going to even bother with hiding spoilers for the main trilogy. I haven't read them yet, but I'm guessing that these stories won't make any sense if you don't know what's going on. Go read the main trilogy if you haven't already. Alright, let's do this. Atonement. Wow. Okay, as of writing this part of the script, I just finished Atonement about 30 seconds ago, and this story fucking hit. And I'll tell you right now that it blows all the Muv-Luv extra short stories out of the water. Atonement is set in the Muv-Luv Unlimited timeline from the perspective of Marimo. After a very brief scene of Takeru's first military lesson in the Unlimited universe, we get to see the beginning of Marimo's military career. We get an abridged version of her cadet training, combat evaluation, and the beginning of her time as a TSF mech pilot. Through this story, we see how a woman who would become a dorky pushover of a teacher in a world without the beta would become an incredibly strong and effective leader in a world with them. So I'm going to mention up front that the way the plot of this story goes, it really expands on the Marimo we knew in Unlimited and Alternative, and it gives us a deeper look at certain scenes from these visual novels, especially the scene immediately after Takeru's first battle. However, to talk about it would require me to spoil key plot points from Atonement, and I'm just not going to do that to you. That being said, there are 2 things about the writing itself that I want to highlight. Firstly, I think it's really cool to see yet another iteration of the cadet to TSF path. In the main series, we got to see Takeru go through it twice. Once as the greenest of the green, and once as a battle-hardened veteran. Back when I first read Alternative, I really enjoyed seeing a different perspective of the training that comprised the bulk of our time in Unlimited. And here in Atonement we get to see it a third time, not just from yet another circumstance, but through a completely new character. Takeru started out very much as a child. Immature, inexperienced, and incompetent, and we saw him grow into the war hero who turned the tide of the war and quite possibly literally saved the world. Marimo is a very different character, and you can tell that she came from a starting point of more emotional maturity than Takeru, and unlike Takeru, who found his purpose and calling after spending time in the military, she volunteered because she refused to let the future she dreamed of be solely in the hands of others. She joined the fight with a purpose. Of course, she still had her own maturing to do, and she was not yet the woman we knew on Unlimited and Alternative, but her journey was fundamentally different from Takeru's even as they parallel one another. And that leads into my second point. The prose of this story is striking in how unique it is, at least compared to what I'm used to with this franchise, and it's certainly night and day compared to anything set in the Extraverse. And before I really explain what I mean, I need to bring something up. Anytime I can talk about prose in a translated work, that's indicative of a fucking phenomenal localization team. I don't care what anyone says, translation is more of an art than a science in my eyes. It is difficult under ideal circumstances to be able to faithfully recreate a set of ideas and all the subtleties that reinforce them, and you need an above average grasp of both languages to even seriously attempt it. Not to mention that Japanese and English are very different languages. Being able to take that already difficult task with different types of prose, which in non-writing nerd terms means the different styles of writing, of how the story itself is told, that is a ridiculously hard task, and I very rarely see it done because quite frankly, I don't think there are many people who can really do it. All my autistic neurons are firing just thinking about it, and this makes me very happy. Marimo has a much more scholarly mind than Takeru. After all, before the world pretty much went to shit, she wanted to become a teacher, just like an extra. She's also much more philosophical and introspective than Takeru, and the way her story is written really showcases that. Most of Atonement is delivered in a first-person narration soliloquy style. She's constantly telling her story almost as a series of mini essays, describing the events and going into detail about her thought processes, what she's thinking and how she's feeling. Even the dialogue segments are never just dialogue. After a few lines tops, her inner monologue will interrupt to provide commentary, which is a stark contrast to how visual novels often let dialogue sequences play out in long chunks before being interrupted. Atonement really gives us a look at the inner workings of Marimo's mind, and I think that's so much more important than the actual plot points of the story. Atonement is very much a supplementary piece to Alternative, and its goal is pretty obvious. It gives us a clearer picture of Marimo Jinguji, and it's so hard for me to really express it properly, but the way it's written reinforces the emotional journey that she takes. And there are even subtle differences between how Marimo's thoughts are written when she's a cadet and when she's a fully fledged TSF pilot. It's the kind of thing that I think enhances the reading experience immensely. Big fucking nerds like me will appreciate the intricacies that went into it, and even those who don't really care about the nuances will still feel the emotional effects of this incredible use of prose. And I think they'll still pick up on the differences between Atonement and the main trilogy. I am left very impressed. Of all the stories I've read from Photonflowers so far, Atonement is the first that I can honestly say I don't have any major issues with. I think it did exactly what it set out to do. My only complaint is that I'd have liked to see more, but I think that's just because I enjoyed what I got, not because I necessarily think a longer form structure would have been any better. This was a serious step up in quality. While I appreciated the cozy nostalgia high the Extraverse stories gave me, if this is the type of quality I can expect from the alternative stories, you better believe I'm hype as fuck. And I think it goes without saying that I fully recommend Atonement, though reading through the main trilogy is pretty much mandatory to really get the full effect. Rain Dancers. Okay, this one was interesting. This story is a prequel to Unlimited, an alternative set roughly 5 years before the start of Muv-Luv Unlimited. The protagonist is an Italian TSF pilot by the name of Monica Giacosa. Notably, Rain Dancers takes place entirely in Europe, and the story doesn't even feature a single Japanese character. Monica's squadmates are all Italian except for the commander, who has a terminal case of British. As explained in the little teaser from the story selection screen, Monica's younger brother appears in Muv-Luv Total Eclipse, which I have not yet read. So as someone who has only experienced the main trilogy and Photonflowers so far, I really appreciated finally getting to see a first-hand look at a piece of the history of the Beta War. The story takes place in Sicily, and for the record, I have Sicilian heritage, took Italian in high school, and have actually been to Sicily, not far from where Rain Dancers takes place. So this is all really cool to me. I'm going to do my best to look past that since I know most of you will not have that kind of connection to the story, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Monica's squad are the titular Rain Dancers, a TSF squad tasked with battle testing the prototype Typhoon TSFs. These are not the first line of TSFs, but they are essentially the first step in a new design philosophy for them. At this point in history, TSFs are mainly manufactured in the US with a focus on mobility for hit-and-run tactics. The Typhoon takes some inspiration from the Japanese Takamikazuchi, which is not in mass production, to create a model more geared towards direct engagement. And the Rain Dancers are essentially the guinea pigs where it comes to actually using these things in combat. The Rain Dancers are deployed to back up the fighters in Sicily who are attempting to defend a key sea passage that serves as an important part of the naval supply chain. It's kinda neat seeing this because it reflects on actual history, seeing as Sicily, due to its sea access and proximity to Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, has always been important for establishing trade and conquest, which is why it's been occupied by so many different nations and empires over the years. So I've been going on about the lore that this story touches on, and I've barely even discussed the actual plot, and there's a reason for that. The plot is actually relatively shallow. It does have some deeper themes surrounding camaraderie through adversity and fighting to preserve one's history, but it doesn't really explore them all that much and instead uses those themes more as a backdrop for the here and now. And granted, maybe if I had read Total Eclipse some of this stuff might resonate more with me, but my takeaway thoughts are that it's meant to be more of a showcase of these important characters at this important point in history. I do have one complaint. This is relatively minor, but it's something I see in a lot of Japanese visual novels and anime. This story is fully voice acted, as are the others, and since this is a Japanese product, the voices are done in Japanese, even though I'm pretty sure they're canonically speaking Italian. This is all fine, but then you get a moment where the British captain stationed in Sicily is speaking his native English with a thick Japanese accent. And as a native English speaker myself, that never fails to break immersion. And that happens all the time in anime, presumably because it's harder to find native English-speaking voice actors in Japan. So I get it, but it's something that I feel is a big flaw in many works that are otherwise great. I just can't internally reconcile a Brit saying, "ladies and the whatnots." Now, that doesn't mean this story is bad. In fact, I think it's quite enjoyable. For one, we get an awesome high production value fight between Monika's squad and the beta, and it very clearly reminded me that Muv-Luv has some of the best action sequences in the visual novel medium. And the story wisely chooses to focus on Monika and her captain, with the rest of the squad essentially serving cameo roles. So the limits of the flash fiction structure don't hurt the story too much, and we still get to have a real look at our protagonist and the primary supporting character. If they had attempted to do the full ensemble here, that would have royally fucked any attempt at character work, and I'm glad they didn't. It's hard to really express what's going on in the story without spoilers, but there is one scene where Monika and the captain are talking, shooting the shit, and also discussing some of the deeper thoughts about the war and their experience with it. It's nice, though I'm left wanting a bit more. Again, I feel like it probably builds on stuff from Total Eclipse in the same way that Atonement built on the main trilogy, so I may return to Rain Dancers after I eventually get around to Total Eclipse. But as is, it's a fun story that I don't regret reading, but it didn't blow me away. Confessions. Holy fuck. I just finished reading this story and I am absolutely blown away. I know I've still got 2 more stories to read as of writing this part of the script, but I'm going out on a limb and saying that there's a solid chance that Confessions is the best story in the Photonflowers collection. So let's talk about it. The protagonist of this story is Michiru Isumi, captain of the Isumi Valkyries, which Takeru's squad becomes a part of in Muv-Luv Alternative, though this story takes place before the formation of the Valkyries. Confessions also serves as a soft sequel to Atonement. So the interesting thing about Confessions is that if you've read the main trilogy, you've already heard this story. Or well, you've sort of heard it and know how it ends. See, in Alternative, Isumi, in a one-on-one with Takeru, tells him the Cliff Notes version of this story. And at the time, this registered as an interesting little blip to me. It was a good piece of dialogue that serviced a touching moment as part of a wider story arc. But the prospect of hearing this story in its entirety is an enticing one for sure. After all, we get to see a formative moment in both Isumi and Marimo's development. So to set the stage a bit, Confessions takes place when Isumi is undergoing her TSF training. So after the field test, but before actually being commissioned as a TSF pilot. But what I found most interesting at the start was the side cast. Firstly, there was Marimo, who at this point is not the tough but kind-hearted person we knew in Atonement and in Alternative, but rather a cruel hard-ass of a drill instructor who's earned the nickname Death. Think of the stereotypical drill sergeant and crank that shit up to almost comical levels, and that's Marimo Jinkuji. Seriously, it's a fucking miracle that nobody under her went postal. And if you've read Atonement, you kinda get it. You know what pushed her to be this way, and if you've read the main trilogy, you'll know that not only is she a genuinely good person, but she does eventually mellow out to the point of actually being likable. So while this is definitely Isumi's story, Marimo still occupied my mind from start to finish because you can't help but feel for her. Because even though she does some truly horrendous shit throughout the course of Confessions, you know that her current state is a result of poorly processing a ludicrous level of trauma. The other thing that caught my attention is Isumi's squad. See, she was assigned the role of squad leader, and as a result she has 3 others she's responsible for. The interesting thing about them is these are characters we've never seen before. None of these 3 girls would go on to join the Valkyries. So while you may have a limited idea of what went down if you remember Alternative, you'll still be asking yourself, what happened to make these 3 not stick around? And speaking of Isumi's squad, I am genuinely impressed at how they were handled. Seriously, we don't really get very much time with them, all things considered, but here we have 3 complex, unique characters, each with their own goals, desires, and personalities. Not to mention that they have some serious chemistry together. Every moment with each of these 3 girls served a purpose, and not so much as a single line of dialogue went to waste. By the end of the story, I was completely invested in the group dynamic, and though I already kind of knew what was going to happen, I was still on the edge of my seat anticipating the actual details. So what's the story actually about? Well, it's ultimately the story of Isumi learning to be a leader, how to squeeze excellence out of your subordinates, and how to stand strong against unfair and impossible odds. Structurally speaking, Marimo serves as the antagonist of the story, making life hell for Isumi's squad and actively trying to get them to resign from military service. Throughout the course of Confessions, Marimo pushes Isumi to the breaking point in more ways than one, and it's through this intense animosity that Isumi's squad go from being peers and colleagues to a found family of sorts. And I have to reiterate, Confessions does a stellar job at building up these characters and showcasing their bond as a unit, despite the fact that this is in fact a short story. There's also a lot of tension surrounding Isumi and Marimo and their eventual confrontation. And of course, there's the fact that these 2 would eventually mend their relationship and be on really good terms by the time Alternative rolls around, and you do kind of see how that happens. But I'm not going to talk about that part very much due to spoilers, even though it's also really well handled. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I should probably introduce Isumi's 3 squad mates. There's Takamiya, the kind, popular athlete of the group. She's been able to more or less breeze through her life and regularly tries to uplift the others and encourage them through kindness. Miura is physically the smallest and weakest of the group and has both a timid nature and an inferiority complex. She's also kind of the baby of the group, both with her childlike naivete and the fact that the others tend to protect and even coddle her. So a big driving point of her story is that both her body and her personality are in a sense holding her back from her true potential. And last, there's Fujisawa, who's very blunt, rude, and callous on the surface, but is fiercely loyal and protective at her core. One of the major plot elements that kind of stokes the existing conflict between Marimo and Isumi is the fact that Miura shows herself to be the weak link of the squad. As mentioned earlier, she's physically the weakest, and she also didn't really believe in herself, so she therefore didn't push herself quite as hard as she really should have. And Isumi is essentially tasked with dealing with this situation, and there are several courses of action that Isumi trials and considers. Takamiya champions the uplifting route, offering additional training and positive reinforcement to build Miura up. Fujisawa is more results-oriented and opts to think outside the box, skirting the rules and trying to take the heat off of Miura. I won't elaborate because spoilers. And Marimo actually puts forth two options via her interactions with the group. The first is the one she outright states. She considers Miura to be a liability and a weak link who should be encouraged to put in for a transfer. Essentially, she says to remove the bad apple before it gets the rest of them killed in battle. But in another instance, Miura collapses during training, and while the squad wants to give her medical attention, Marimo instead just starts kicking the shit out of her, and tells her that her only options are to get the fuck up or die. And wouldn't you know, she taps into reserves of willpower and adrenaline she didn't know she had, and she got back up and finished the training, only receiving medical attention for the beating afterwards. It can't be ignored that while Marimo's approach was fucking evil, it got results. Isumi had to balance and consider these different leadership styles, and as we know from alternatives, she doesn't really land squarely with any of them. With the Valkyries, she cared about her squad and wanted the best for them, but she also pushed them to her limits, allowed for bending of the rules when necessary, and understood that sometimes you need to depersonalize and accept that sacrifices will be necessary. The only Isumi we've known up to this point is the strong and highly capable woman we knew in Alternative. I personally found it fascinating to see the seeds that were originally planted in her mind that would eventually allow her to grow into one of the best commanders in the UN. Confessions is ultimately a character exploration of Michiru Isumi with a healthy side of completing the Marimo puzzle. We see bonds form and get put under strain. We see Isumi get tested and pushed to her limits by an instructor who, though cruel, is genuinely trying to prepare her for the war that she's seen firsthand. And we also see Isumi grapple with the different questions of leadership, even in such a limited capacity. What do you do when someone's not pulling their weight? What do you do if your subordinates are breaking the rules? How much should you care about those underneath you when you might have to make decisions that will negatively impact them? And what do you do when someone just straight fucks up? These are not easy questions to answer, and though I'm not going to spoil what actually happens, all this stress and the challenges she faced do ultimately mold her into the woman we met in Alternative, and she eventually does reach an understanding with Marimo. There's so much I want to talk about with Confessions, but I've been having a really tough time with this part of the script because I don't want to spoil anything for you, and it's just hard to balance those two desires. But one thing is abundantly clear to me. Confessions is a fucking amazing story. Easily the best out of Photonflowers so far, and I would argue it's on the level of the main trilogy in terms of quality. In fact, the only real complaint I had is that there was a minor plot thread which was meant to highlight Isumi's familial difficulties and then show how they paralleled her struggles in training, and I felt it was kind of forgotten about. But aside from that, I think Confessions is reason enough to pick up Photonflowers. It had me feeling the kind of things that I felt when I was reading Alternative way back when. 100% read this story, though make sure you read Atonement first. And I would actually recommend reading Confessions right after Atonement. I have no idea why they decided it would be a good idea to break up these stories with the much less compelling Rain Dancers. But once again, amazing stuff here. Let's move on. Chicken Divers. Okay, I really liked this one, but it left me with different feelings than I would normally get from a Muv-Luv alternative story. Chicken Divers takes place during the Battle of Sadogashima, which is the climactic beta hive assault from Alternative. You know, the big one. Our protagonist is a soldier named Henri, though aside from 2 lines of dialogue, he's only referred to by his call sign, Aquila 1. He's part of the Aquila Orbital Diver Unit. Now the way hive assaults go is that they're spearheaded by these orbital diver units who effectively act as shock troops to make the overall assault much easier. These units are made up of the best TSF pilots, handpicked for their skill. That being said, diving is the most dangerous role there is, with a roughly 20% survival rate per drop. For every 100 divers, 80 die. Of those that remain, 16 more will die in the next drop. A third drop might as well be a death sentence, statistically speaking. Those few soldiers who are brave enough, stupid enough, and lucky enough to volunteer for a third drop are given the somewhat irreverent informal title of Chicken Divers. Aquila 1 is one such madman. This whole thing actually makes me think of how this mirrors real-world military history. World War I was the first time we really had any kind of aerial warfare, and even though it was very primitive, both sides needed to put people in the air or they'd be giving the opposition a huge tactical advantage. It was also the case that flying in World War I was incredibly dangerous. Like, the average life expectancy of pilots was only 17.5 flying hours. That's not a lot. That's one thing I've always liked about Muv-Luv. There's a lot of nods to actual military tactics in history, and I feel like a lot of the things that happened in the Muv-Luv alternative universe are actually pretty grounded and logical when you think about it. Chicken Divers is not the emotional gut punch I'd have expected. This is not a story of love and loss, of personal growth, or anything like that. In fact, we don't really learn all that much about Aquila 1 at all. Chicken Divers is a look at the experience of a veteran soldier barreling towards hell on earth. The divers were more or less a footnote in alternative. They were certainly talked about, but only really as a cog in the machine, as Takadu's squad was understandably far more concerned with the 0-0 unit than anything else. Chicken Divers gives us a look at this crucial piece of the puzzle. And though it's clear that Aquila 1 has a history, he has his reasons for fighting, and he's definitely not without regrets, none of that really matters. They're there, but the story makes it clear that you don't really need to know about anything more than the here and now. There's not really all that much more I can say. Chicken Divers is a story to be experienced. You get to see through Aquila 1's eyes as he takes you step by step through the process of dropping from orbit into an assault on a beta hive. This was a great story and a great way to kind of change things up after the incredibly powerful story of Confessions. Okay, one more. Inheritance. Ooh, I really hate to close out this video on a sour note, but holy fuck did they fumble this story. It started out really strong and then just fizzled out for no real reason. God fucking damn it. Our protagonist this time is Captain Isumi's younger sister Akira. The story starts right in the middle of the Battle of Sadagashima, though Akira was part of the diversion rather than the main assault. And it starts out really brutally, with Akira's squad getting completely wiped out while she's in the midst of a panic attack. The only reason she made it out is because she was saved by Tsukuyomi and the Royal Guard at the last possible second. She escapes with her life, but is left with PTSD and a healthy dose of survivor's guilt. The rest of the story deals with the immediate aftermath of the battle, which is quite interesting in terms of lore. Even though the victory at the Battle of Sadagashima is likely the turning point of the war, it's still far from over, and we didn't really get to see how that played out in alternative. But the main focal point of the story is the reunion of the Isumi sisters. And after a really touching moment of love, care, and acceptance that definitely made me feel things, Akira learns about the death of Michiru Isumi of the Isumi Valkyries. Now, here's the thing. This is all really solid. I feel like they were setting up for a really powerful and emotional character arc dealing with grief, trauma, nihilism, and guilt. But then they just kinda hand-wave it away. The story just resolves itself out of nowhere. It's like they fucking sliced 3/4 of the story off and called it a day. There was so much potential, and I'd argue that the initial reunion between Akira and her sister Marika is one of the best individual scenes in Photonflowers. It frustrates me to no end that they didn't even attempt a proper story arc. They just said, fuck you, story's over. Inheritance is a story that got absolutely shafted. I am in absolute shock that such a talented writing team dropped the ball so hard. Words cannot express how disappointed I am that Inheritance will never realize its potential and that my Photonflowers experience was closed out by this shit. I'd still recommend reading it purely due to how amazing that one scene was, but don't get your fucking hopes up for the rest of the story. Overall, Photonflowers was a wonderful experience. The extroverse stories weren't the best things I've ever read, but they were cozy, fluffy, and tickled me in all the right places. The alternative stories were where it really stepped up into the Muv-Luv that I remember. While Inheritance was a massive disappointment, Atonement and Confessions completely stole the show, and really showcased how good the writing of this series can be. I would say that every story is worth a read, flaws and all, and ultimately I'm very glad to have had the opportunity to read Muv-Luv Photonflowers. My one recommendation is that when you start on the alternative stories, you should probably read Rain Dancers first. Atonement and Confessions should really be read consecutively, and being squashed in between those two stories did Rain Dancers no favors. And before I close out the video, it's super thanks time. We've got Jacob KL1 coming in with a whopping $10. Fucking weeb. While I am extremely grateful for your support, I do need to correct you. I'm actually not legally allowed to be a weeb because I don't like tsunderes. But for real though, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It means a lot to me that you think my dumb ass is worth your hard-earned money. Reminder for the rest of you, if you want to have me read out and respond to your comment in my next video, use the super thanks option down below. Thanks for watching. Big thank you to my patrons, and especially my God tier supporters, Bulk Squat Thrust and Michael Rotolo. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to help me out by leaving a like and subscribing if you want more. Also, Twitter and the Discord server are linked below, so there's that. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. play the electro swing.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back.